Media bias has been a pervasive issue that's been completely exposed over the last year through the atrocity propaganda and the media complicity, the work of lots of media organizations, journalists, and companies, organizations like NewsCord have exposed the media, the extent of the media's complicity in the Israeli crimes in Gaza. Today, we have with us the founder of NewsCord, Nima Akram, who will be discussing with us media bias and complicity. Thank you for joining us, Nima.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with what is NewsCord and how did you come about creating it?
Yeah, so NewsCord is essentially a news platform that uses artificial intelligence to find different sources covering the same topic, and essentially through comparing the coverage automatically, kind of unearth the inherent hidden agendas and the the narratives and tone of language differences that Western media has against, say, for example, like an alternative news source or a Middle Eastern news source. So the point of it is to make it really accessible for people like us, or just the everyday person that consumes the news, to just as easily as they go onto the BBC, for example, to now go onto something like NewsCord, our website and soon app, to essentially get all of the perspectives in one place and even see the differences too.
I mean, this is something I thought was really important. I feel like we've been needing something like this for a long time. How would someone like me, who wants to see, who reads a red headline on, for example, the Daily Mail, and I want to see what everyone else is saying, how would I use NewsCord to discover that?
So there's multiple ways. Like, let's say you're reading a particular headline which you think, okay, this is kind of problematic, but I don't really know why. Like, it just feels, quite biased. It could be something really subtle, like passive language instead of active language. You can literally copy that article URL into our website or the app, and it will give you it will find all of the other sources talking about that story, and it will show you the differences in headline and even the differences in the article, which I think that's a big time saver because it's hard to read so many articles. And actually, very recently now, we translate articles that have been written in different languages. So, for example, I don't know if you know, but Al Jazeera Arabic is a lot more, let's say, direct than even Al Jazeera English.
Right.
So it's very interesting to now see the likes of CNN and BBC against Al Jazeera.net. So yeah, that's the way you do it. And also, actually, you can just go on NewsCord itself, the website, and on the homepage, it will give you all of the biggest differences. And that's what we do. That's how we create our Instagram posts, where we kind of expose the inherent media bias and stuff like that.
I see. You mentioned the passive and active language.
Yes.
Could you kind of quickly explain what that means and what other tools some organizations might use in order to...
Yeah, so obviously I'm not a journalist, so for me, I didn't even know this myself until I really started looking into this and started building up NewsCord. But it's a very subtle way of kind of softening the impact by using passive language. So, for example, a headline could read, 23 Palestinians die after a Israeli airstrike hits a tent. So, technically, this has told the story. This has given us, 23 people have been killed. But actually, the ordering in which that was said, and actually, they technically never say Israel killed those 23 people. It's kind of they did die after the Israeli attack. So it's it could be some sort of indirect cause, essentially. And maybe, some people say you're digging too deep here. But actually, on a high level, if you keep reading headlines like this, it does have that overall effect of just softening the impact over time. Whereas you may see Middle East Eye, for example, they will say Israel kills 23 Palestinians. It's simpler, it's shorter. So you'd think that these the likes of BBC and CNN would like to keep it simple, keep it short, which in some ways kind of proves that they're purposefully making the headline longer, using this passive kind of clouding your judgment in a way, or lulling you to kind of just say, okay, yeah, this is unfortunate, let's move on. So yeah, that's a very subtle and probably the most common tactic that Western media uses, is this passive tone of voice.
Are there any other tactics you have discovered through your work?
So yeah, there's been so many tactics which I guess you can kind of group into bigger, I guess, techniques. This tone of language, let's call it, active versus passive. There's also, other journalistic styles. But then also a big one is omissions of key details. So, it will be, for example, in Gaza, 23 people died or 23 people were killed by an airstrike. The BBC is notorious for this so many times, like, countless amounts of times. They've just completely missed out the keyword in there, the attacker. So yeah, that's one, omissions. Another one is delegitimization. And again, the BBC, I hate to bang on about BBC, but they've done this again, which is saying, according to Hamas-run health ministry. There's other Western media outlets like the Guardian, even, let's say, Washington Post, which will say, according to Gaza Health Ministry. So there's levels to the, like, what you call hearsay, and by extension delegitimization. So there'll be the likes of Washington Post and the Guardian that will say, according to Gaza Health Ministry, which, like, technically is true. That's who the source is. But realistically, like, these people undoubtedly died. You don't need to say that. Like, Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera, and many more do not say that. But then to say Hamas-run health ministry is another level of just trying to delegitimize it. Like, there's just no need to say this, right? Like, these people undeniably died. There's footage, like, in this era of social media. You see it instantly. You see it before they report on it. So,
yeah.
And then another big theme as well is vilification. So it's like, whoever goes against Israel in terms of, like, in solidarity with Palestine, goes on the streets and protests, the Western media will try its best to either downplay the numbers. So, like, there's the classic case of the BBC who says hundreds protest or thousands protest, and actually it's 300,000 is the number that the PSC gives us. So that's, downplaying. But then also, like, it would be, let's say one person gets arrested, or let's say 4 people get arrested. That would be the headline.
Right.
Say 300,000 people, 4 out of 300,000, like, that's a huge, that's a very small percentage.
Yeah.
For that to be the headline, it's clear what they're trying to do here. They're trying to, like, I guess, limit the number of people that go out to protest if they see that, oh wow, like, people getting arrested here. They're saying some, like, pretty horrible things. Yeah. So maybe I won't go to the next one. So, there's a number of tactics, and it's all kind of goes back to the same thing, which is, like, manufacturing consent and allowing Israel to continue what it does, which is a genocide for over 400 days now, with complete impunity.
Absolutely. Have you, in your work, seen that the articles themselves are better than the headlines? Like, even though the headline might be biased or omitting information, the article then would go into a bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a good point. Like, and this goes to a bigger point, which is a lot of the times the journalists you will see the names. They're like, like, they sound like they're, like, Arab names, and potentially people that you would think, I know this is a generalization, but you would think would be, like, sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. And a lot of the times the articles are actually, like, not half bad. And this is because a lot of the times the editor has the final say on the headline. They will reword the headline, or they will have some guidelines which they will say, okay, we'll change it. And the journalist often does not have a say in this. So it is worth pointing that out, because I am seeing a lot, especially on our posts on Instagram, people getting angry at the journalists, saying, let's name and shame them. And perhaps, like, the journalism may have some part to play in this, particularly, like, of course, some of them have an agenda. Yeah. But I think the bigger issue is a lot more systemic than, like, individual journalists.
What inspired you to start NewsCord?
So what directly inspired me is the aftermath of October 7, when we saw Israel go into Gaza indiscriminately, killing everyone. Like, I don't know how quick it was. I forget now, like, when it, before we knew it, 10,000 people had been killed by them. So by November, I felt so helpless. Like, I'm sure a lot of us, probably watching this, felt and still feel, so angry that, like, we're in the UK here going about our day-to-day lives, people acting like, no one even said anything in the office. Like, people pretending like nothing was happening, because, like, it was a taboo subject at the time, right? Yeah. And now I think it's a bit easier, but I was like, no, like, I need to, do what I can with the skills that I have. It's not like a direct, like, help, but maybe indirectly I can put my, like, technical skills to use. So I thought, okay, what is one of the biggest issues? And I saw that actually Western media is almost like is pivotal to for Israel to continue what they're doing. If it wasn't for Western media, I'm sure that the majority of this country and the majority of the Western world would be out on the streets, like pleading and shouting at their leaders to make a change. So Western media suppressing this is huge for Israel to continue what it's doing. And therefore I thought, okay, how can I combat this? This is like a big angle. And I thought, like the best way to kind of realize the bias and the complicity is by comparing. So it's not saying that, like, for example, Al Jazeera is the gold standard, or Middle East Eye is the gold standard. It's just saying by comparison you can see the different angles and you can very clearly see what's missing. So that's why I started to build NewsCord, and actually specifically where it came from was there's this organization called Deen Developers, and they are like I don't know if you've heard of them, a Muslim community who do amazing things, like bringing people together who have a technical background to build something for good. And they did something called Hack for Gaza in November, and it's crazy to think about back then, because it was a very hush situation, like even having solidarity for Palestinians because of October 7 and because it was so soon after. But like they were courageous and still held the event, and that's where NewsCord was born. And we've continued it since then.
That's amazing. What would you say it's been now a year since you started NewsCord.
Yes.
You've gone through countless articles. Yeah. What would you say was the most important discovery or discoveries that you made during your work?
So in terms of like individual discoveries or of like individual headline examples, I guess, one that springs to mind is Sky News, who have consistently been like amongst the worst, which, for reasons that I can go into as well. But the one headline, which I think was published last month, was something along the lines of four teenage Israeli soldiers named as killed by Hezbollah after 23 die in square quotes in Gaza. So this is one headline. So they're essentially like, one, combining two different situations into two different events. Two, they're saying teenage Israeli soldiers are really trying to maximize the emotion there. Like, these were young kids essentially. Naming the attacker Hezbollah. And to be honest, in isolation, none of this is a problem. Like, it's fine, But then to then follow it up with a hyphen and then say as 23 die in Gaza. So it's like you're showing the double standards in one headline. Yeah. So I don't know what was going on in the office that day, but like they did not even have time to proofread this and realize that like we're showing the biggest example of double standards here, which I believe this headline specifically should be in the archives forever as like, journalist degrees and courses about what propaganda is, because they've shown all of the tactics, all of the different techniques of downplaying one thing and maximizing another, all in one headline.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Is this headline still up to date?
It's still up to date. I think they removed the square quotes, like the 23 die, but it's still essentially the same, yeah.
Oh. Are there any other kind of discoveries, broad strokes, maybe patterns that you've also noticed through your work?
Yes, one big pattern is the manufacturing consent, and what I mean by this specifically is kind of very prominently, all of them together, all of Western media together, very prominently covering, for example, Netanyahu pleading, this is how they frame it, pleading to the Lebanese to get rid of Hezbollah. Like, yeah. I don't know how this is possible. You probably remember this was a few months ago, before they escalated their bombardment.
He pleaded in English to a non-English speaking population.
Yeah, so I mean, none of it really makes sense once you like really reflect on it. He's saying it in English to the Lebanese, pleading. He's actually not pleading. This is the thing. What he actually says is, "You will turn into the next Gaza." Yeah. That is actually a threat. But the way the BBC framed it was Netanyahu's plead to the Lebanese falls on deaf ears. This is the headline.
Wow.
So it's like, this is manufacturing consent. They're saying that, Netanyahu really tried here, but like the Lebanese didn't listen. So it's kind of saying, what's going to happen now is kind of acceptable because, he tried, but they didn't listen. Obviously, we know how ridiculous this is, but this is consent manufacturing playing out in real time. We're seeing it now because we're realizing we're very alert to it. And you can imagine this has been happening for decades now,
Yeah. And you mentioned you want that you could speak about why Sky News is so bad. I'm assuming BBC is one of those as well. Could you go into that?
Yeah, so Sky News specifically, Sky News were owned by Rupert Murdoch and his family for I think 30 years, and he doesn't own them any longer, but he still does own Sky News Australia, Fox News, as well as many other news outlets, and this in itself is problematic because Rupert Murdoch, and this is actually well documented. I think Mint Press created a really nice article about this, and he's a staunch ally of Israel. He's a friend of Netanyahu, and this is problematic, right? Because he has a bias, he has an agenda to push the Israeli what Israel was trying to achieve, and immediately this means that the outlets that are owned by Murdoch is problematic. So when you see a Sky News headline like that and you realize who owns it or who owned it and kind of their background, then it does start to make sense, and it just further proves why we need to this kind of NewsCord's purpose, make everyone be aware of these things and how every news outlet has an agenda, and you cannot just read one. It's just it's not the right way to consume news.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that he sold Sky News in the UK, because there's a very distinct, clear difference between Sky News Australia and Sky News UK.
Yeah.
Sky News Australia, I'd say, is more similar to Fox News or GB News here, while Sky News UK maybe is more similar to the BBC.
Yeah, is it? Yeah, I guess you would put them in the same category. I would say Sky News is probably a bit more sensationalist than BBC. BBC has very neutral wording, but yeah, Sky News Australia is another level of sensationalism where they really try to maximize emotion.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to delve into a few specific examples, and I know you guys have done a lot of work on these, especially in recent weeks. So, Amsterdam.
Yes.
This is a masterclass in media bias, in really lies spread by the media. If you can get into that.
Yeah. So I'll try to cover this topic. I mean, it's actually really straightforward how it all played out, and we could all predict it and see it unfold in real time. Yeah. And it's actually the benefit of social media in a way. We saw the kind of the night before the mainstream media started covering it. This is where the main antagonist, the Maccabi Israeli fans, were kind of racist slurs, mocking the dead children in Gaza who were killed by Israeli forces. Yeah. Saying death to all the Arabs, even attacking reportedly Arab cab drivers, ripping down Palestinian flags. The list of aggression, things that they did that were aggressive is just endless, right? There's basically violent chants and all the rest of it, as well as that in the actual game, which was I think Maccabi versus Ajax, they did not honor the 1 minute of silence for the flood victims in Spain. Yeah, there is overall very disrespectful hooligans, I think is a fair term. But interestingly, there's no coverage of this in real time whilst it was happening. Yeah. But the day after, when there was retaliation from pro-Palestinians, who I guess ultimately took a stand and said, look, you can't just say this and get away with it. This is what took the headlines, and all of us waking up, we saw the headlines across the board was anti-Semitic attacks. The Telegraph went as far as to call it a pogrom, as well as other, as well as the Times, I think. And several others. Essentially, the framing was completely one-sided. Yeah. And you can imagine how many people fell for this. I mean, look at the layperson, on their way to the office or on the tube, they're reading the headlines and they're like, this is horrific. And I'm sure this is based on a study, but 80% of people do not read past the headline when they're consuming the news. So you can imagine if the headlines are just saying anti-Semitic riots or attacks, pogrom, this is going to evoke the emotion that these people are horrible. Why are they attacking these Israeli fans? Completely disregarding the full story. And actually, based on this, we kind of started covering it and showing how there were some alternative outlets, such as Middle East Eye, as well as many others that did, I guess, more accurately cover what was going on and at least show the full story. Yeah. And we created a post about this where we got these results from NewsCord, picked apart the biggest, the most egregious things that basically, particularly Sky News and the BBC did. And we partnered up with Accountable Media, who do amazing work in basically making it really easy for us to complain to these outlets. So they started up this campaign. We collaborated with them, and we kind of explained the how problematic this is and told people to complain. And actually, before we knew it, after several days, 30,000 complaints were sent to the BBC and Sky News as a result of this, I guess, campaign. So we're definitely trying to hold them accountable. I mean, if they reply or pivot based on our complaints, is a different story. But definitely, this was a big case of Western media kind of seizing the opportunity to really vilify a group of people, in this case pro-Palestinians, and by kind of covering it just in one angle. And even now, if they backtrack, it's too late. So we saw Sky News several days later released a report where they actually covered it fairly, and then they pulled it, and everyone saw this in real time. Within 5 minutes, they pulled the report, they modified it, pushed it back out. And I think they pulled that again as well. So there's a whole thing going on there. It's a big mess, very embarrassing for them. But it just goes to show how, this isn't done by accident. This is all done, intentionally. We can see it playing out in real time now. And I think that's what's unique about this, the way it's done now, is that everyone's aware of it. And, how this plays out in the long term, who knows? But definitely, if we wanted to cover this positively, there is definitely progress we're seeing. More and more people are waking up, relying less on mainstream media, and definitely social media has a part to play in that as well.
Yeah. This may be also the only time in recorded history when the mainstream media, heads of state, all back racist hooligans.
Yeah.
I've never heard of this before. But did you see from the BBC any changes after the complaints were sent?
We've not seen any yet. We have seen the BBC in the past pivot based on complaints, but more when I guess pro-Israelis actually complain to the BBC that they are too pro-Palestinian or too anti-Israeli. We have seen them adjust their headlines or subsequent headlines based on this, but so far the BBC has been very, very consistent in their framing of everything to do with Israeli attacks on Gaza and even stuff like this. They are not they are not moving from this, straying from this framing, and they're seeming their guidelines basically of always downplaying the suffering of the Palestinians.
I see. And has it been the case that any mainstream outlets have changed their stance? I mean, this what happened in Amsterdam is now, everyone knows what happened, right? Everyone knows that the racist Israeli Maccabi fans started with their slurs and with disrespecting the residents of Amsterdam. And yet, I don't know, has there been any change from the mainstream media?
Off the top of my head, no, but it's possible that a few might have added that. I don't know. Is it Sky News that maybe they added something? I think the bigger point here really is, even if they did add, if they did after pivot and change the framing and say actually even actually a good example is the New York Times. They at first actually spread a clip, footage or image of the Maccabi fans attacking. I think it was an Arab or a Palestinian, or were they ripping down a flag? Or I think they were chanting. They were doing they were doing provocative chants, racist slurs. And the way the New York Times represented this was that actually this was an anti-Semitic attack. They were trying to say this was the Palestinians or the ones in solidarity with Palestine that were doing this. They later corrected it at the bottom in a footnote saying, actually, we cannot independently verify this, without even really saying, this was false or admitting their mistake. But so even if they did change track, this is an example of them saying, actually we were wrong in a way. What's really important here, and it actually goes back to the initial October 7 attack, when everyone was spreading the false news that the babies were beheaded.
Yeah.
It does not matter if you then if it's the first news, the initial releasing of these reports that has the biggest impact. This is what everyone sees. People move on so quickly in this modern day and age. Like people will see the initial headlines and you know, I don't know the numbers, but like not even half as many people will see the modifications later.
Yeah.
So it's the initial framing that is the most problematic thing. And even if some of them do, you know, start to adjust their framing afterwards, the damage is already done.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like they still need to be called out for this, so that it doesn't happen in the future. Like next time, do your due diligence, or I mean, this is assuming that it's a mistake, which I think at this point we're starting to realize, or we know, you know, that this is not a mistake. This is all intentional. So.
You said that you believe there's been progress. How do you quantify that progress?
So progress, really, what I mean by progress is awareness. It's more people are realizing. I don't think there has actually been progress from these Western media outlets or you know, the mainstream media outlets. Like it's more people are aware of it now. Like more and more people are saying, you know, let's boycott Western media completely. Let's stop relying on them. People's now calling it legacy media. People now on social media and you know, this is all, and it's not just, you know, NewsCord making people aware of this. There's, you know, countless other individuals that are active on Twitter, particularly calling out these headlines. So for me, it's really an awareness piece. That's the progress. It's not the Western media who has, you know, they've not really changed their framing. They've not budged at all.
We've seen with Amsterdam in particular, we saw the people who filmed the original content. They called out the media. Saying that they're lying essentially, or they're misrepresenting what's been recorded. There's what you mentioned earlier about Times, the New York Times. I think that was the footage recorded by a Dutch journalist, and she called out multiple organizations for using that footage to say it was anti-Semitic, and no one seems to have changed their stance. We saw. There was that young Dutch journalist who was threatened by some Maccabi fans. We saw the videos of them chanting as they came back to Tel Aviv airport, to Ben Gurion airport, chanting why there are no schools in Gaza because all the children are gone, right? Things like that. And yet, as you've mentioned, the legacy media have not changed their stance with all of this evidence. What does it say about the legacy media that what they are putting out there is so far removed from reality in this way?
I think at this point it goes to show that they are just relying on the people that, you know, I think it is a decreasing number of people that solely rely on this, and I guess, and this is a generalization, but it's typically going to be the older generation that are just relying on these outlets. They're relying on these people to just consume what they come out with, essentially, and banking on the fact that these people will not realize that actually there's a bigger story here. Because for us, it seems ridiculous, right? It's like, how can you not change your framing, you know, despite the evidence that's now on social media, you know, well documented. And to me, the only reasonable justification is they are still relying on the layperson to not have the time, or to be too ignorant to look elsewhere.
I'd like to briefly look at another story which you've done a lot of work on, which is the killing of Dr. Adnan al-Bursh. Could you take us through who Dr. Adnan was and what the story was and how the media covered it?
Yeah, so this is a horrific story of a hero of Gaza who, you know, in May was ultimately killed by Israel whilst he was being detained and tortured for months in a prison. He dedicated his life to trying to help the people of Gaza by trying to save the children and, you know, the men, the women that were torn to pieces by Israeli attacks. And when he was, you know, abducted and taken to prison and ultimately killed, the way the media reported on this, and there was some mainstream coverage of this, CNN BBC, The Guardian, and several others. And I do go into detail about this on the post. This was back in May, so it's November now, so 6 months ago. They said, across the board, consistent with this, that he dies in prison after being detained. So very neutral wording, not saying he was killed, not saying that he was tortured, despite countless witness testimonials at the time from other prisoners saying that he was tortured. So this information was already out there, but this was ignored. I think the BBC and the Independent, both UK outlets, completely ignored this information. They did not use the term tortured at all in their articles. Obviously, several months later, Sky News kind of come out with a report, and I have to use quotes here because I don't know how investigative this report really is. I mean, they've used testimonials from witnesses who had already said months ago that he was tortured. But regardless, I think it's important actually when things like this do happen that you do give some credit. So I think Sky News does deserve some credit here for coming back to the story several months later, because they didn't need to. Realistically, they came back to it and they did cover it. But unfortunately, you could call it bias, you could call it hidden agenda, complicity. It comes back in when they kind of they destroy their own credibility by saying, uncritically covering that, there are claims that he was a terrorist. Without saying that Dr. Bursh was detained without charge. There was no charge against him. Like many other prisoners, there's no charge against them whilst they're in prison. Without saying it's completely unfounded. There is no evidence to suggest that he is a quote unquote terrorist. So Sky News says this uncritically. I mean, just uncritically covering this, even though you are saying with hearsay, you are saying that they are saying he's a terrorist or they are claiming he's a terrorist. This needs to be, you need to be very clear here, like that he was held without charge. And really, making sure that people don't just read this and now think, oh, he was tortured, he was, potentially raped, but actually, it's fine because he was a terrorist. So actually, Sky News, they did cover this, but, what did that really do? If you're now casting that much doubt to your readers by saying he was a terrorist, what was the point, right? So yeah, this is what the post covers. It kind of says this was initially covered in May. People moved on and it wasn't covered accurately. It really downplayed the significance of this. And then even actually when you compare the coverage in May to more the Middle Eastern sources and the alternative sources where they maximize the emotion of this, they really explain, the significance of this man. He was a hero. He was a surgeon. He dedicated his life to saving people. But then you look at the mainstream and it's so heartless. They don't care. They do not convey this emotion. All they're focusing on is trying to minimize the impact that this has or downplay and protect Israel. And it's heartbreaking to see, particularly when you look at these individual stories. I think, if you take a step back, this is just one person, and look at the hundreds of thousands of stories that there probably is like this, where there just isn't enough coverage on it for whatever reason. But I think stories like this are really powerful because it shows that this is one individual that is a person. It's not just a number. When you say 90 people killed, obviously this is horrific, but when it becomes a number, it's not as emotional. But when you focus on these individuals, it really it really speaks to you personally. And the Western media is just not doing this justice. There's other examples of individuals being the focus, like Hind Rajab, like Tala, who was also killed whilst she was a child, whilst she was playing in Gaza. There's Muhammad Bahai, who was a young guy with Down syndrome who was killed by Israel when they unleashed their attack dogs on him. So these individual stories really pull at your heartstrings. But Western media does cover it, but they they do not do it justice. No. They try to minimize it.
Was it Hind Rajab who someone in the Western media described her as a woman or something?
So this was CNN called her a woman, even though she was only 5 when she was killed. So, these are things, and another example of that is Sky News. I think this was several years ago when a girl was shot at a border in the West Bank, like a Palestine-Israel border, and said, the young lady, and she was only 3. So, these things, it goes to show, like, these are, like, you can call them slip-ups in a way, but it does go to show, like, the systemic, like, bias that is within these people. And this kind of goes into a whole other topic of, like, it's not just it's not as simple as saying, this is just systemic complicity where, like, they're helping their ally Israel. 100%, I do believe that is the case. But actually, there is also a racism element to this as well, where, like, if you cast your minds back to the beginning of the Ukraine war, there would be reporters on CNN saying that this isn't the Middle East. How can this be happening to people that look like you and me? Like, this is a white English American man saying this. So, there is this inherent racism as well that's built in.
Speaking of racism, I think if we look back to the riots that happened in the UK, there's probably a very good example of racism. You did some work on that as well.
Yes. Yeah, so, that seems like a lifetime ago, but it was not too long ago, where I think this was the UK kind of coming to a boiling point, I would say. I think definitely the genocide in Gaza had a part to play in this, particularly the way that Western media had covered the Palestine protests over the past, I guess, 10 months at the time, or 9 months, where they were saying, arrest, dozens arrested and stuff like this, basically making the pro-Palestine protests look really a lot more violent than they really were. And this kind of, I think this is the reason why a lot of the far right who were, the racists that were rioting were, I think they were saying, two-tier care, which was saying basically you're letting the Palestinians, the pro-Palestinians protest, but you're cracking down on us, with the police and stuff like that. And the only reason why they think this is because they think that, what they've been doing, which was attacking Muslims or attacking places of worship, they think that's what, they think that's equivalent to what the pro-Palestinians have been doing every week. And for anyone that's been to these protests, they can see how peaceful it is, how it's, like, very beautiful, like, people from all different walks of life coming together. So that it's not comparable with what these rioters were doing when they were, being racist and destroying things. But because of Western media and the way they vilified the pro-Palestinian protests, they seem to think that this is justified, and that's where I think two-tier care comes from. So you can see even in this case, the UK riots, how Western media played a part, and I guess in this case, British media.
I want to touch on one of the most recent posts you guys have done. I think there was an attack on Beit Lahia. Could you take us through what you guys discovered there?
Yeah, so this was shocking. Like, I made this post yesterday. I didn't know whether to wait or give it some time, or should I just post it straight away. And I ended up, posting it in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time. And essentially, like, Israel killed 72 people in Beit Lahia, in northern Gaza, after and including 22 children. In a single airstrike, and it had been 5 hours since the attack happened. It was in the morning, 6 a.m. And I was looking, like, Al Jazeera's covering it, Middle East Eye's covering it. You got several other, like, alternative news sources, and all of the other, like, smaller Arab, like, local outlets in Lebanon and Palestine had covered it. But nothing from Western media, like the mainstream, like I'm talking BBC, CNN, and the like. And I was scratching my head, like I was like, is NewsCord broken? Like, cause I look at our website for this because it aggregates all of the sources, but yeah, no, like nothing at all. And I started to dig into this and realized that actually, like, this is another issue now that's becoming more prominent, which is the media blackout. And this is a very scary time because I don't know if you've noticed, but the likes of the BBC, CNN, The Guardian, Washington Post, they've all turned off their live feeds now. So, like, for the past, for the first year of the genocide, there were live feeds every day. Like, people could go on the BBC and they would give you the full flow of information, like Al Jazeera continues to do it now as well. But that has now stopped. You'll see that the Ukraine live feed is still continues after several years, but the Gaza one has now been shut down. You don't see it now, and this is a scary time because it means they cherry pick the story, they control the flow of information. And exactly like this scenario where the angle that we took with this Instagram post was that it's been 5 hours yet no coverage. Like, how, is this not newsworthy? And what actually makes this even more egregious is with the case of the BBC, where the BBC Arabic website had published an article about it, saying that 72 people have been killed. And actually, like, a perfect headline saying Israel kills 72 people. But no, not BBC English. Even, as I'm sitting here with you, they still have not published an article about this. I mean, since when is killing 72 people in a single attack not newsworthy now? Like, this is normalization. This is another tactic they use, which is normalization, making this normal, It's fine if we don't report this because this is every day now in Gaza. And yeah, I think a development actually, which I plan on covering tonight, is Associated Press did ultimately release publish an article about this, but they used a much lower estimate, which apparently medical sources is their primary source for this, which they estimate that 30 people have been killed. So they have come out with this lower estimate, which is less than half of the 72. And also, very consistently, Associated Press did this, and several other outlets. They combine this news in the headline with the news that a Hezbollah commander was assassinated in central Beirut. So both of these situations, like across, 4 or 5 mainstream outlets did this. They combined these two events in one headline, which does not even make sense. These are completely different situations. One is in another country for one, and both stories individually are important enough to be covered separately. So it's bewildering how they waited until this assassination story to then combine the headline. This is in some ways a false equivalency by putting two things in one place, even though one is completely different, and a lot more a lot more people died, 72 people. That should have its own headline.
Yeah, I mean, with all of this, it's evidence of not only a bias or turning a blind eye, but an active attempt to aid the Zionist agenda in Gaza. Do you see it that way?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this kind of dehumanization of the Palestinians through all these techniques that we've been talking about absolutely plays into the Zionist agenda, which is in the short term now we can talk about is the annexation of Gaza. It's now at the point where this is that Israel can do this. They've completely leveled in northern Gaza, and this talk of annexation is now becoming normalized. Western media is now covering this without any critique, just kind of saying, this is what Israel is now planning to do. And this would, they've made this possible over the past year by dehumanizing, repeatedly. It's like, now they can do this. They've made it possible. And yeah, absolutely, it plays into their agenda.
The work you do is truly very crucial. And I really hope that all of our viewers and people beyond check out your work and use the resources that you provide. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.